Hello and welcome to MBKM Models. Today we are going to talk about the Flying Tigers. Flying Tigers, the first American volunteer group of the Republic of China Air Force, nicknamed the Flying Tigers, was formed to help oppose the Japanese invasion of China, operating in 1941 to 1942. It was composed of pilots from the United States Army Air Corps, Navy and Marine Corps, and was commanded by Claire Lee Chennault. Their Curtis P-40B Warhawk aircraft, marked with the Chinese colors, flew under American control, recruited under President Franklin Roosevelt's authority before Pearl Harbor. Their mission was to bomb Japan and defend the Republic of China, but many delays meant that the AVG first flew in combat after the US and Japan declared war. The group consisted of 3 fighter squadrons of around 30 aircraft each that trained in Burma before the American entry into World War II to defend the Republic of China against Japanese forces. The AVG were officially members of the Republic of China Air Force. The group had contracts with salaries ranging from $250 a month for a mechanic to $750 a month for a squadron commander, roughly 3 times what they had been making in the US forces. While it accepted some civilian volunteers for its headquarters and ground crew, the AVG recruited of its staff from the US military. The Flying Tigers began to arrive in China in April 1941. The group first saw combat on the 20th of December 1941, 12 days after Pearl Harbor. It demonstrated innovative tactical victories when the news in the US was filled with little more than stories of defeat at the hands of the Japanese forces, and achieved such notable success during the lowest period of the war for both the US and the Allied forces, as to give hope to America that it might eventually defeat Japan. AVG pilots earned official credit and received combat bonuses for destroying 296 enemy aircraft, while losing only 14 pilots in combat. The combat records of the AVG still exist, and researchers have found them credible. On the 4th of July 1942, the AVG was disbanded and replaced by the 23rd Fighter Group of the United States Army Air Forces, which was later absorbed into the US 14th Air Force with General Chennault as commander. The 23rd Fighter Group went on to achieve similar combat success while retaining the nose art on their famous aircraft. The American Volunteer Group was largely the creation of Claire Chennault, a retired US Army Air Corps officer who had worked in China since August 1937, first as a military aviation advisor to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek in the early months of the Sino-Japanese War, then as director of the Chinese Air Force Flight School centered in Kunming. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union supplied fighter and bomber squadrons to China, but these units were mostly withdrawn by the summer of 1940. Chiang then asked for the American combat aircraft and pilots, sending Chennault to Washington as an advisor to China's ambassador and Chiang's brother-in-law, T.V. Soon. Chennault spent the winter of 1940 to 41 in Washington, supervising the purchase of 100 Curtis P-40 fighters and the recruiting of 100 pilot, 200 ground crew and administrative personnel that would constitute the first AVG. He also laid the groundwork for a follow-on bomber group and a second fighter group, though these would be aborted after the Pearl Harbor attack. Of the pilots, 60 came from Navy and Marine Corps and 40 from the Army Air Corps. One Army pilot was refused a passport because he had earlier flown as a mercenary in Spain, so only 99 actually sailed for Asia. 10 more Army flight instructors were hired as check pilots for Chinese cadets, and several of these would ultimately join the AVG's combat squadron. The volunteers were discharged from the armed services to be employed for training and instruction by a private military contractor, the Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company, CAMCO, which paid them $600 a month for pilot officers, $675 a month for flight leaders, $750 a month for squadron leaders. No pilot was recruited at this level, and about $250 a month for skilled ground crewmen. Some pilots were also already promised a bounty of $500 for each enemy aircraft shot down, and this was later confirmed by Madame Chiang Kai-shek. The first batch, some 300 men, departed San Francisco on the 10th of July 1941 and arrived in Rangoon, Burma on the 28th of July via the Dutch ship Jagersfontein, operated by the Java Pacific Line. The second batch, some 30 pilots, departed on the 24th of September 1941 and on 12th of November 1941 by way of the Dutch ship Boschfontein. These volunteers used civilian passports in these trips. After arriving in Rangoon, they were initially based at a British airfield in Toungoo for training while their aircraft were assembled and test flown by Camco personnel at Mingal Laden Airport outside Rangoon. Chennault set up a schoolhouse that was made necessary because many pilots had lied about their flying experience, claiming pursuit experience when they had flown only bombers and sometimes much less powerful airplanes. They called Chennault the old man due to his much older age and livery exterior obtained from years flying open cockpit pursuit aircraft in the Army Air Corps. Most believed that he had flown as a fighter pilot in China, although stories that he was a combat ace are probably debated. Of the 300 original members of the Camco personnel, 9 were Chinese Americans recruited from America's Chinatowns. All 9 were trained at Allison Engine Works in Indianapolis, Indiana. All were P-40 mechanics. On arrival in Kunming, 2 other Chinese Americans were hired, a Ford motor truck specialist and a doctor. Total original Chinese Americans were 11. Prior to 4th of July 1942, 3 of the P-40 mechanics resigned. The official AVG roster lists the original 8. The AVG was created by an executive order of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. He did not speak English, however, and Chennault never learned to speak Chinese. As a result, all communications between the two men were routed through Sung Mei Ling, Madam Chang, as she was known to the Americans, and she was designated group's honorary commander. Chennault preached a radically different approach to air combat based on his study of Japanese tactics and equipment, his observation of the tactics used by Soviet pilots in China, and his judgment of the strengths and weaknesses of his own aircraft and pilots. The actual average strength AVG was never more than 62 combat-ready pilots and fighters. Chennault faced serious obstacles since many AVG pilots were inexperienced and a few quit at the first opportunity. However, he made a virtue out of these disadvantages, shifting unsuitable pilots to staff jobs and always ensuring that he had a squadron or 2 in reserve. The AVG had no ranks, so no division between officers and enlisted soldiers existed. Chennault and the Flying Tigers benefited from the country's warning network, called the best air raid warning system in existence, starting from areas in Free China, in hundreds of small villages, in lonely outposts, in hills and caves, stretching from near Canton through all Free China to the capital of Chongqing and to Lanzhou far northwest, are a maze of alarm stations equipped with radios and telephones that give instant warning of the approach of Japanese planes. When Japanese aircraft attacked, Chennault's doctrine called for pilots to take on enemy aircraft in teams from an altitude advantage, since their aircraft were not as maneuverable or as numerous as the Japanese fighters they would encounter. He prohibited his pilots from entering into a turning fight with the nimble Japanese fighters, telling them to execute a diving or slashing attack and to dive away to set up for another attack. This dive and zoom technique was contrary to what the men had learned in the US service, as well as what the Royal Air Force pilots in Burma had been taught. It had been used successfully, however, by the Soviet units serving with the Chinese Air Force. AVG fighter aircraft came from a Curtis assembly line, which had just started producing Tomahawk 2B models for the Royal Air Force in North Africa. The Tomahawk 2B was similar to the US Army's P-40C, but there is some evidence that Curtis actually used leftover components when building the fighters intended for China, making them closer to the old Tomahawk 2A specification. For instance, the AVG aircraft had fuel tanks with external self-sealing coatings, rather than the more effective internal membranes as fitted to the P-40C Tomahawk 2B, and the aircraft built for China lacked the later Tomahawk's fittings to carry a drop tank and addition of an armor plate in front of the pilot. The fighters were purchased without government-furnished equipment, such as reflector gun sights, radios, and gun wings. The lack of these items caused continual difficulties for the AVG in Burma and China. The 100 P-40 aircraft were crated and sent to Burma on third country freighters during spring 1941. At Rangoon, they were unloaded, assembled and test flown by personnel of Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company, CAMCO, before being delivered to the AVG training unit at Tungo. One crate was dropped into the water and a wing assembly was ruined by saltwater immersion, so CAMCO was able to deliver only 99 Tomahawks before war broke out. Many of these were destroyed in training accidents. The 100th fuselage was trucked to a CAMCO plant in Loiwing, China, and later made whole with parts from damaged aircraft. Shortages in equipment with spare parts, almost impossible to obtain in Burma, along with the slow introduction of replacement fighter aircraft, were continual impediments, although the AVG did receive 50 replacement P-40E fighters from USAAC stocks towards the end of its combat tour. AVG fighter aircraft were painted with a large shark face on the front of the aircraft. This was done after pilots saw a photograph of a P-40 of number 112 Squadron Royal Air Force in North Africa, which in turn had adopted the shark face from German pilots of the Luftwaffe's ZG-76 heavy fighter wing, flying Messerschmitt Bf-110 fighters in Crete. The AVG nose art is variously credited to Charles Bond and Eric Schilling. About the same time, the AVG was dubbed the Flying Tigers by its Washington support group, called China Defense Supplies. The P-40's good qualities included pilot armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, sturdy construction, heavy armament, and a higher diving speed than most Japanese aircraft. Qualities that could be used to advantage in accordance with Chennault's combat tactics. Chennault created an early warning network of spotters that would give his fighters time to take off and climb to a superior altitude where this tactic could be executed. The port of Rangoon in Burma and the Burma Road leading from there to China were of crucial importance. Eastern China was under Japanese occupation, so all military supplies for China arrived via the Burma route. By November 1941, when the pilots were trained and most of the P-40s had arrived in Asia, the Flying Tigers were divided into 3 squadrons. First Squadron, Adam and Eve's, Second Squadron, Panda Bears, and Third Squadron, Hell's Angels. They were assigned to opposite ends of the Burma Road to protect this vital line of communications. 2 squadrons were based at Kunming in China, and a third at Mingaladan Airport near Rangoon. When the United States officially entered the war, the AVG had 82 pilots and 79 aircraft, although not all were combat ready. Tiger Eric Schilling, part of the 3rd Squadron, commented, "This was the beginning of the greatest adventure I would ever hope to experience. It wasn't till years later that I fully realized the magnitude and significance of this first step to be a lifelong adventure in the mystic Far East." The AVG's first combat mission was on the 20th of December 1941, when aircraft of the 1st and 2nd Squadrons intercepted 10 unescorted Kawasaki Ki-48 Lily bombers of the 21st Hikotai attacking Kunming. The bombers were jettisoned their loads before reaching Kunming. 3 of the Japanese bombers were shot down near Kunming and a 4th was damaged so severely that it crashed before returning to its airfield at Hanoi. Later, Chinese intelligence intercepted Japanese communications, indicating that only 1 out of 10 bombers ultimately returned to base. Furthermore, the Japanese discontinued their raids on Kunming while the AVG was based there. 1 P-40 crash-landed. It was salvaged for parts. The mission was one of the earliest American aerial victories in the Pacific War. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Please don't forget to subscribe as it helps the channel, and also like the video. And until next time.